Last time we poured cast so that we would have wouldn't have this tongue space all obliterated with stone. We poured it in such a way that we can get to all of the peripheries and be able to make a tray. Now, the first thing we want to do in determining our trays, we want to look at the anatomy of remember the anatomy of the mouth, look at the cast and try to determine what the length of the periphery should be. I usually start that by looking on the palate of the maxillary and looking for the fovea palatini. And we see those right here, and I want to make sure that my tray is at least as long as the fovea palatini, and preferably just slightly longer than the fovea palatini. And in addition to the fovea palatini, we want to look for the Hamular Notches, which generally are going to be right about here. We can see coming out of the back of this right here the pterygomandibular raphe, and we want to look for the Hamular Notch, which means that our tray wants to come through the Hamular Notch, and it's going to be about this length of the Hamular Notch on either side. And then we want it slightly longer than the fovea palatini, so we want that tray to come to about this area, just about there. Now we want to look at the facial surfaces, starting with the buccal space area. And if we remember the anatomy in the buccal space area, which is that space that you're going to find just lateral to or just outside of the tuberosity. There's really no muscular influence involved with that, so we can carry our tray down as deep as the fold goes, and that seems to be about right there. The next thing we want to look for is the zygomatic arch, and this is the zygomatic arch area right in here, and we know that we cannot apply pressure to that zygomatic arch in this manner, so we want to swing that tray up a little bit to circumvent that zygomatic arch. So we want it about that length. Then on this cast it doesn't show up the buccal frenum very well, but we know that right in the area of the first premolar, second premolar, there's going to be a buccal frenum, and we want to make sure that this tray skirts that buccal frenum about like so. So it'll form sort of a little notch right in this area. We need to remember what the mouth looked like, what was the depth of that mucobuccal fold, and basically it was fairly shallow in the mouth, and so we want to remember what that was. So I'm going to guess that this is about the length that we saw in the mouth as far as the mucolabial fold in the area of the central incisors and lateral incisors. They had a very heavy buccal or labial frenum, which we want to skirt about like so. And then we're going to come around the other side and do the same thing. Look right here, we can actually see the little buccal frenum coming up right here, so we want to skirt that buccal frenum and put a notch to allow for play of the buccal frenum in that area. Here's the zygomatic arch. We don't want to get up onto that zygomatic arch, but we can allow it to go all the way to the depth of it in the buccal space area, that space just lateral to the tuberosity. Now for relief on a cast such as this, what we're really interested in is to make our tray in such a way to provide a little spacing on the inside of the tray so that we don't get a lateral pressure from the tray as we make an impression, a pressure that's lateral going into a vertical wall, such as an area here like we have in the premolar area. So we don't want any pressure around this entire facial surface around through here in our final impression. What we want on that is just enough spacing in the tray to prevent a lateral pressure going into the side of it. In addition to that, we would like for a stop on our tray. We want to use hard horizontal plates of cortical bone as a stop for our tray as much as we can. So we're going to utilize the palate for that. And on the maxillary, usually the palate will make a good stop for your tray. Now if you have a torus on the palate, you're going to have to skirt that and put some relief over the torus. But if you don't have a torus and it's just nice and flat, then we can use that entire palate as a stop for our tray. So as a consequence, what we want to do is we want to place wax for relief from the crest of the ridge facially, leaving the palate as a stop for the tray. And when we get around to the incisive papilla area, we want to make sure, now here's the incisive papilla, we want to make sure that we skirt that incisive papilla and provide some relief over the incisive papilla so that when we make the tray and make the impression, we don't place pressure on the incisive papilla. So from the crest of the ridge facially, we will want 1 thickness of base plate wax is what we're using as relief for the tray. So we're going to use a sheet of base plate wax, and with a flame, we're going to heat that wax just to get it nice and pliable. And cut a strip of wax off that would be sufficient to cover half of the relief that we've planned, which would be this area. So we're going to heat that nice and pliable now, get it nice and soft, and lay that 1 layer of base plate wax over the cast and adapt it in real well and real tight to the cast. Once you have it adapted, then I will take a knife usually and cut off the excess, but I usually cut that excess off to the depth of whatever that primary cast gave us. Do not cut it off to your planned height of where you want the tray to go. We'll be cutting the tray back later to that planned height of where we want the tray to go, but don't cut your wax off to there, and the reason for that is we do not want a lip left on the inside of the tray. We want that tray to be smooth on the inside, and we don't want that little lip that, as in crown and bridge now, you're taught to leave a little lip on the inside of the tray, and that's great for crown and bridge prosthodontics, but for complete denture prosthodontics and making a complete denture tray, that lip is detrimental to us because it'll cause a pressure on the ridge that we don't want. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to form a junction area for the first layer of wax I put on here now for the one side, and I'll get rid of that so that when I place the other side on it, I'll have a nice smooth junction of the wax there. And then I'm going to warm a knife, and I'm going to cut out right to the line, which you can see on here. I'm going to cut right to that line at the crest of the ridge, the wax off, and get rid of that that's on the palette, and adapt it in real well. And now our relief is complete for the one side. That's all the relief you need, just the 1 layer of base plate wax. Now with that in mind, we're going to heat another little strip of wax in the same manner and apply the wax to the other side. Don't end up with wax on the, or no wax over the incisive papilla for protection of the incisive papilla in the final impression. This is the relief wax as we like it, which is 1 layer of base plate wax attached to the cast from the crest of the ridge out. We want to adapt some tin foil. I like to use .001 tin foil as a separator between the wax and the tray that we're going to make. The reason for that tin foil as a separator is that we do not want to pick up onto the tray the melted wax. As our acrylic resin sets, it has an endothermic reaction that creates heat, and that will melt the surface of the wax, and it will, as it melts the surface of the wax, it will make the tray not very retentive to your impression material later on. And I know the question always comes up, why do you use tin foil rather than something real cheap like aluminum foil? Tin foil can be burnished onto the cast and get nice and smooth. If you use aluminum foil for it, what you usually end up with is a very wrinkled surface to it and a very unaesthetic tray that really does not work very well. Tin foil comes to us in 1-pound packages from the manufacturer, and we're just going to cut some little strips of the tin foil off. We don't need much of this, we just need a piece about like so. We can set the tin foil aside now. And what we're going to do is we're going to cut this in 2 pieces, and we're going to adapt the tin foil now to the cast. Lay 1 layer of it on and adapt it with your finger real well. Push it down onto the cast real well. And then we can take the other half of it, and it can overlap that original piece that we have. Take the other layer of the tin foil and let it overlap. There we go. And we adapt it in and rub it into it real well to sort of burnish it to the cast. And once you've done that, and you've got it burnished in with your fingers like that, what I usually like to do is take a wooden handle of a knife, and that will burnish it quite well. And you can work a lot of the wrinkles out of it just by burnishing the tin foil to get it down to a nice smooth, as smooth as we can get it type of surface. You can use the ball of your finger, or you can use a wooden handle knife, or one thing that I use quite often is cotton rolls. Cotton rolls work quite well for burnishing it. If you have a pencil with a very, very large eraser on it, a pencil eraser works well for burnishing tin foil. You can see that works some of the wrinkles out. Okay, and the smoother you can get this, the better it'll work for you. But about like so, and you can see there's a little spot in here that we don't have tin foil over, but that's not going to bother us in one way or the other. Okay, if that were wax in that area and we were trying to protect it from the wax, then we would want to cover that. But since it isn't wax, we can leave that one alone. Okay, now that one is ready at this point. The material comes in a black package, much like photographic film used to come in black packages to keep it from being exposed to the visible light. So the material itself has paper on either side of it, and the way that we use the material is to take the paper from it, and now we're going to adapt that to the cast over top of the tin foil. In order to keep it from being sticky to your fingers, I usually like to have a little water and keep my fingers moist as we're adapting it. And just very well adapted, I usually start on the maxillary in the palate and then work it down from the palate around the peripheries, from the crest to the ridge, work it down all the way around the peripheries and make sure it's well adapted onto the cast. Then we can take a knife, cut the excess material from it, and we're going to save that material for just a little bit because that material is going to be used, the excess material we have, is going to be used to form a handle for the tray. Now, I remember before I put this on here that we had those lines, the black lines that we used were up from the periphery a little bit, so I'm going to cut the excess off of this also so that we don't have so much trimming to do once we get the tray constructed. There'll be a lot less trimming than if we left that material on there. So we can cut that off before we ever start because I know that's excess material. From the excess material that we've trimmed off, I've formed a little rectangular piece of material, and I want to make that rectangular piece of material about 1.5 centimeters long by about 1 centimeter wide, and the thickness of it maybe 5 or 6 millimeters into a little rectangular piece of material like so. This material is going to be used to form a handle. That handle is placed at the midline of the anterior portion and just adapted down and adapted in with the remaining material that is there, just from the original material, adapted in until it's nice and smooth, and it should be tilted anteriorly about 15 degrees from the vertical. And right now, see, this would be vertical, and it should be tilted anteriorly about 15 degrees. The purpose of this is twofold. First of all, on the maxillary arch, this handle helps us to manipulate the tray in and out of the mouth when we're making impressions. And the other thing it does is this is the beginning of aesthetics for our eventual dentures, because what this handle does, it simulates the position of the natural incisors on the patient. This allows us to control the length and thickness of the labial periphery a little better than it would if we had no handle. Now that this material has been adapted, the next procedure from there will be to cure it in the Triad unit. Now that we've adapted the material to the cast, we need at this point to paint the outside portion of the material with a coating, which is Triad's air barrier coating. I like to do that by pouring a little of it into a cup so that we don't waste any material. A brush, and put a gentle light coating of the air barrier material on the external surfaces of our tray. And once we have it painted with the air barrier material, we place it into the oven. Turn the oven on and allow that to cure for 4 minutes. Sometimes you may want to raise the table just a little to get a little better concentration of the light onto the object you're curing. Now that the 4 minutes is up, we can remove this from the unit itself. And the next thing we wish to do is to pry the tray from the cast. Now we can take the tin foil from the inside of it. And now we're going to paint the inside of the tray with the air barrier material. And once we've done that, we're going to place it back into the oven and cure it again for 4 minutes. And since the cast is not there, I'm going to raise that table just a little more, about like that, so that we get a maximum concentration of the light onto the material. After the trays have been cured, we need to remove the wax from each of these primary casts to get it back down to the point where all of our lines that we drew on these casts originally are exposed now so that we can see them. For the most part, we won't be very far off with this one. We'll just need a little trimming here and there to smooth the peripheries, because the peripheries are quite rough at this point, and we need to round off and smooth those peripheries and get them at the original length where we intended those peripheries to go. We do that by means of some acrylic burrs, which are from the Brasseler Corporation, and they come to the university, buys these from the Brasseler Corporation, and we keep them in a little container like this that can be sterilized for clinical use. So we use a fairly large burr in a slow speed handpiece to trim those peripheries. So this will make a bit of a mess when you do this. And all we're going to do is just use these burrs and trim the peripheries till they're nice and smooth, not jagged or rough. And you don't be afraid to use your finger to feel of these to make sure that all of the sharp edges and jagged edges are off of it, because those jagged edges will injure your patient if you place this in the mouth with those edges like that. After we think we have the jagged edges off, we place it back onto the cast and see if there are areas that need to be trimmed. And yes, we have an area here where we have the notch for the buccal frenum needs to be trimmed, the notch for the labial frenum needs to be trimmed, and again the notch for the buccal frenum needs to be trimmed here. Those notches for the frena attachments are best trimmed with a smaller burr than the large one that we were using for smoothing out the peripheries. So we'll put a much smaller burr in, and now we're going to judge where that buccal frenum would be and make a notch for it. And the buccal frenum, we want that notch quite V'd out so it provides space or room for the buccal frenum to work anterior, posteriorly, or vertically. We need a little bit more on the anterior portion of that notch. And that pretty well has that notch cleared. Now we're going to do the same on the other side. Almost there. And now we need to trim for the labial notch, the labial frenum. And that's almost vertical. We do that one. And just round it in a little bit in all directions so we don't end up with sharp edges on it. Now this tray is pretty well trimmed as we would like it to be when we try it in the patient's mouth.